Okay, I wanted to record my presentation about backup for the Kapiti Camera Club. So that way we can watch it at the meeting, but we can also watch it again afterwards. So I'll just open up my slides. I have a few slides. So this is about backup, and it's all about protecting against data loss. So we're all making pictures and wanting to retain those pictures now and in the future, and so we need to make sure that we protect our pictures, because computers do crash or break or go up in flames. Before anything, we first need to make it very clear what the difference is between backup and archiving and publishing, because a number of the services that are available are either one or the other, and not being clear about what you want to achieve can lead to unexpected consequences. So if you want to make a backup of your data, of your pictures or whatever, you're essentially going to retain the original and keep on working on the original, and the backup is a temporary copy, an additional copy that you make. You don't destroy the original, you keep on using it, and the backup typically gets outdated pretty quickly as you add new pictures to the main core of all your picture collection. So if the original gets destroyed, then you use the backup as a safety net, and you just restore the backup, and you might lose a little bit of work or much work depending on how frequently you create your backups. So typically if you make backups, they tend to have a limited lifetime, so they are not kept forever, because what happens is as you're working away, the backups that are stored somewhere get more and more out of date, and eventually they're just useless. So any backup service that you find online, for example, will only keep your backups for a limited amount of time. Contrast that to archiving. That's when you don't have enough room, or let's say you finished a project, you don't need the project live anymore, but you do want to retain it for future reference. So maybe it's a commercial product, you did something for a customer, and you expect that the customer might eventually return and want a new project or an update to the project, but you don't want your hard disk cluttered with a massive amount of video files or picture files. So in that case, you don't want a backup, you want to archive the files. So in that case, you actually take the original and store it away, and then you can delete the files off your computer. So the archiving should have an eternal lifetime. It's meant to be forever, so that you can always get it back. So that's quite different than what backup does. And then there's a third thing that you might encounter, that's publishing. So where you want to share your material, your projects, whatever, with other people, so they can view them or see them, and not necessarily they're not necessarily the same as the source material. So for example, Flickr is a publishing service. So you publish your images as JPEG files, and people can look at your images, but you will, for example, not be able to store the raw files on Flickr. So Flickr should not be confused with a backup or an archival service. It's a publishing service. It's kind of similar to what you do when you print your pictures. When you print your pictures, you don't have the negatives or the original files anymore. It's just a book. That book is a publishing service. So it's something that's derived from your source material. Righty. So in order to achieve these things like publishing and backing up or archiving, we're essentially going to make copies. So it's all about copying the data, and there's a number of ways you can copy. So one way of copying is you make a copy of whatever you have on the same disk. You have an internal hard disk, there might be plenty of room on it, and you might just say, well, let's duplicate this. And that's a form of backup. It's not really archiving or publishing, it's just backing up. That's something you could do. You could also make a copy on an external disk, for example, a USB thing, for example, or a USB flash dongle. So the nice thing there is that you can have as many as you want. So you can have 2 external disks or 20 external disks, that's all possible, and you can make a copy from your computer onto the external disk. Another way to copy is onto DVD or Blu-ray discs. So there is writable discs that you can store information on, and you can write them from your computer. So that's another way to do copies. Another one is tape drives. So you can actually purchase tape drives that you connect to your computer, and you can then write a copy of whatever you want to copy onto the tape. You can make copies of the stuff you have on in the cloud. So for example, Flickr or Dropbox or OwnCloud or Nextcloud or OneDrive or iCloud. There's many different services that actually allow you to store information somewhere in the cloud, which means somebody else controls a server that has lots and lots of disk space, and you store your material on that server. And slightly different, there's also a cloud backup. So there's services where you can actually make copies of your data with the specific purpose of being a backup. So that it's like a safety measure, really designed as a safety measure. Whereas other services in the cloud like Flickr and Dropbox and so on are not created with the express purpose of being backups. Okay, so talk about copies on the same disk. That's okay, you can use that, but you should only use it as a very short-term precaution. Say like you're going to do something drastic with your source material and you just want to make sure you can go back if something goes wrong. So because the risks of having a copy on the same disk is if there's something wrong with the computer, your copy also dies along with it. So if your computer gets physically destroyed, or the hard disk wears out or gets too old, or if you make a mistake, you accidentally delete stuff and empty the trash or the rubbish bin, or you overwrite a file with an older file, or you accidentally delete everything from the project and save it and then only discover that 2 weeks later, or you might spill coffee on your computer, or you might just not be rigorous, which means you make copies when you think of it, and then eventually you forgot to make a copy a few times, and then something bad happens and there is no recent copy because you forgot about it. That's another risk. So all these things are problems with making copies on the same disk, and they would affect either typically backup or archiving. So copies on the same disk is something I would rarely use, most of the time only as a short-term precaution, like when I'm about to do something drastic and I want to make sure I can go back quickly. It's more about speed than about depending on it. Better is copies on an external disk. So a lot of the same risks, but the nice thing is that we can do it multiple times. We can use multiple external disks. So risk is still physical destruction. You drop the external disk, somebody runs the car over it, suddenly it heats up and burns something, your house burns down. Wear and tear, still a problem. Aging of the disk is a problem. User error, still a problem. And one of the things that happens quite often is backing up in the wrong direction. So if you're doing manual backups and you suddenly get confused and you mix up what is the backup and what is the original, and then you take the backup and overwrite your original with the backup. It's happened more than once. Accidents still, and not being rigorous, those are all risks with copy on an external disk. So what can you do to help avoid those risks? You can use multiple drives and physically store them in different spots. So you might actually have another disk, one of your disks stored at your so somewhere with a family member, or at your place of work, or in your car, or so. And the more you have, the better. It takes a bit of doing because you need to physically move the disks and swap them around. Avoiding user error is typically by automating it, and on Apple's there's a system that's built into the Macintosh, which is called Time Machine, which takes care of almost everything related to backing up. All you need to do is connect an external hard drive, and Apple Time Machine can take care of all the rest, like doing it regularly, making sure there's multiple backups, deleting the older backups and all that stuff, allowing you access, allowing you to find stuff. That's all done automatically. Another thing that's important is that you schedule your drive replacement. So any drive, independent of what technology it is, has a limited lifetime. So you cannot just store them away and keep on using them and expect them to last forever. So a magnetic hard drive, for example, after 2 years of daily use as a backup drive, you should consider replacing it, just as a precaution. Because quite often with backupping up, people only discover they have a bad backup once they try to restore. So they've been backing up, something bad happens, they reach for the backup drive and then try to restore it, and then everything goes to custard because the drive is broken. And you never know during the backup, because when making the backup, only the modified files get added to the drive, and there might be lots and lots of files that are unreadable, and you'll never know. So to avoid that, you have to schedule drive replacement and make sure you have in your calendar, after you purchase the drive, say in 2 years' time, I'm going to replace this drive. And if you have multiple drives and one of them goes bad, that shouldn't be a big issue, because you replace them every 2 years, and if one goes bad, there's always another one. So that's another way of making copies. There are some risks with making copies, and that's something that is not really well understood by a lot of people. Say, you might think, oh, let's just get a big USB flash dongle, or some big SD cards, or you want the speed of the backup, so you use an SSD drive, a solid state hard drive, rather than a magnetic drive. Now, all these media are flash based, so they're semiconductor memory, which means it's essentially little containers of electrons, and these electrons slowly leak away. So over time, whatever is stored in a flash medium becomes unreadable. And all these devices have some mechanism in them, like if they're under power, they will continuously do like maintenance on the media and rewrite the things that need rewriting. So they will make sure that there's not too much leakage and rewrite data. If you would take an SSD drive and you store some data on it and store it away for 2 years or something, you might you run a very high risk that there is data corruption when you try to read it back. So you should keep them under power, not just store them away. So that's a big disadvantage. So SSD drives, very fast, but should not be used for long-term data storage, for archival data storage specifically. You also have magnetic drives, so they will retain their data much longer. If you don't power them, you just stash them away, you write the data to them, stash them away, they'll be usable much longer. So they don't wear down, but you might still have problems like, for example, thermal problems or whatever that cause eventually the hard disk to lock up. So you store it away for a few years and then you try to read it and the hard disk doesn't even spin. I've had that happen, so that the platters are stuck. Thing to be aware of is that you might find on eBay that there's large capacity SD cards or USB flash dongles, and they seem to be really interesting, much cheaper than other ones. Quite often they're brands, but very cheap. Now these are most often fake. So, and what they do is these people are essentially malicious. They just take smaller capacity ones and then tweak the electronics a little bit so that the device reports to the computer that it is larger capacity than it actually is. So when you connect it to a computer, everything seems fine. It's like a 1 terabyte USB flash dongle, and the computer will report it to be 1 terabyte. But once you start writing data to it, eventually it just stops and just refuses to take more data. So, and that's because they're essentially just fake devices. So don't try to buy these things cheaply, because quite often you'll end up having something that's quite unusable. Another thing that happens with those cheap things is quite often they come with malware. So they actually have stuff installed to take control of your computer and expose you to, say, like ransomware. So avoid cheap things, especially cheap SD cards or USB flash dongles. Uh, Yet another way to make copies is DVD or Blu-ray. So these are essentially discs like CD discs from a long time ago. And depending on the type of media, you might have really long data retention. So you can actually have guaranteed data retention up to 100 years or even longer. The highest capacities you can get with the Blu-rays ones is not extremely large. I think like I have a few 100 gigs or 25 gigs. They're not so, which means if you're backing up a terabyte of data, you're going to be a disk jockey. So you're going to be inserting and taking out the disks all the time. And the other thing is that I actually purchased a few extra USB readers for these discs because they're fairly cheap, and what I suspect is that at some point in time they'll be really hard to find. So you might have a bunch of DVD discs, and if you only have one reader device and that breaks down and then you can't find a replacement anymore, that would be a very unhappy occurrence. So the trick is to buy a few devices, a few drives to read and write them. Then there's tape drives, so that's kind of still the go-to archival and backup device for the cloud storage companies. So companies like Amazon and Dropbox and whatever. Behind the screens, they'll still be using tape drives for storing stuff. You can get extremely large capacities on tape drives, so many tens of terabytes. But the drives are expensive, so I'm personally not using it because they're just not cheap enough. So it would cost me an arm and a leg, and they're also not very fast, which means it takes a long time to read them. And the nice thing about them is they have a long data retention, so normally they should be good for a few tens of years or something at least, if not longer. So if you're really serious about backup, tape drives and multiple tapes and multiple drives would be the way to go. Like for an actual professional outfit doing photography, I think tape drives would be the way I would go. Now, about online stuff, cloud stuff, Flickr is not a backup service. You can make copies, but you can only upload JPEGs to Flickr. So you can, and movies, but you can't store raw files, which means you lose your original material. So it's okay to use Flickr to publish stuff, say like share pictures with the family or with people you work with, that's okay. Another big thing, and that actually applies to all cloud services, is that the future is uncertain, but especially with Flickr, it's just recently been taken over by another company, and they are continuously asking for support and additional money and whatever, so which means they might pull the plug at some point in time. So it's not a certainty. So anything that goes into Flickr is iffy. So don't rely on it to retain your pictures for you. Then you have all forms of cloud storage. So for example, Dropbox, or you might have Apple iCloud, which has photos, so they can store your photos, or Google Photos, or Microsoft OneDrive. They're all trying to do the same thing. They all try to tie you to them. And the trick they do that is you install their software. And initially that's all fine, so you can just store stuff there, but typically things like Dropbox will essentially store whatever you have on Dropbox also on your hard disk. So it's kind of, well, Dropbox is a copy in the cloud, but the original is still on your computer. But then eventually your computer is nearly full, and then they'll propose to you, hey, do you want us to store your data so you can free up some hard disk space? And once you do that, then you're tied. So you can't go back. Because as time goes, you'll be storing more and more and more stuff in the cloud and not have it clutter your hard disk. And once you hit a few gigabytes or a few terabytes, it becomes really, really hard to get that stuff out again. So it's, well, it's almost impossible to retrieve that data within a reasonable amount of time. And then you're tied, and then you will be paying the subscription forever. So personally, I don't store any stuff. I use these services, all of them, but I use them as a go-between. So a way to move stuff between computers or a way to send stuff to people overseas or whatever. Rather than attaching data to emails, I put them in a Dropbox folder or an iCloud folder and then share a link, and then people can download them at their own time. A big disadvantage of cloud storage is that you have no recourse if they just stop or go bankrupt. So then your data just poofs away and you'll never see it again. One option is you could run your own service. So there is cloud storage software. For example, one popular one is Nextcloud and OwnCloud. There are two twins almost based on the same original software. And then you can build your own little server, either run that server with a cloud service provider or on a physical computer you keep at home. And that they work pretty much exactly like Dropbox or OneDrive or whatever. They integrate the same way, but you are in control of that service because you run that computer. You make backups of that computer. You archive stuff of that computer. You upgrade it, and so if your house burns down, that computer will burn with it. It depends where it is. But it gives you a lot more control. So the data stays in your control. So, and that's the option I used to use Dropbox. I've gone off Dropbox because essentially they got on my nerves, and now I'm using my own cloud. Now, there's a separate type of service called Cloud Backup, which is not the same as Dropbox. That's essentially making copies to a service that's geared towards backup, which means temporary copies. They don't last forever, but they're there so you can go back in case your computer gets stolen or disappears or crashes or completely burns up. And the nice thing is these things run in the background. So you need a good internet connection, but they try to not hog your internet connection, so the backup can take quite a while if you have a large computer. And you can access those backed up files via web browser, so you can retrieve individual files if necessary. And the one I use Backblaze. They offer a service where you can say like, hey, take all my files that I backed up to you and put them on a hard disk and then send the hard disk to me. And the prices are very reasonable, so it's almost the same price as a new hard disk. So the way to do it is just say occasionally get them to send the hard disk to you, and you have an extra hard disk, plus you have a extra copy of all your files. They also retain your files for a limited amount of time, and you can pay them a little bit extra to retain them longer. So I have one of my computers, my main workstation, I have a data retention of 1 year, which means they allow me to go back for 1 year in the backups they made. After, if it's more than 1 year, they'll be gone. They won't be there anymore. So these are all the ways you can make copies, and that's essentially the raw material, making copies with which you build your ideas for archival or backing up. But when you start making copies, you always have to make it clear in your own mind what you're doing, archiving or backing up. So things I've learned that you should avoid is, first of all, if you're not rigorous, which means it has to be a habit, it has to be automatic, it has to happen all the time. So if you're not backing up or archiving in a very rigorous and regimented way, it's not going to work, and then the time you need that backup, it won't be there. So you have to make a plan. work it out, so make sure that backup is happening exactly as much as it needs to be. The second thing, you should avoid to rely on only one form of backup or archival. So 2 is a minimum, 3 is even better, and the more the better. Another thing to avoid is not trying out your full circle, so not actually trying to restore some files. So it's all good and well to make backups, and you keep on making backups, and you never try them out, and then eventually catastrophe, try to restore the backup, and turns out something was forgotten, and for some reason you can't restore the backup. That happens. So you have to do a dry run. Actually try it out. Try restoring files from your backup to make sure everything is as it should be. Another thing to avoid, getting tied to an online service. So if there's too much data in the cloud that you don't have locally anymore, then it's very hard to get back out. It's a bit like a drug addiction. So once they get you to take the drug, you're kind of hosed. Also, never trust hardware. Hardware breaks. It will break. So your hard disk will eventually give out. Your SSD drive will eventually develop bad blocks. Your flash drive will eventually become unreadable. Your SD card will break. So it's just a certainty. It's not if, it's when. So don't trust the hardware, and make sure you have a way to cope with broken hardware and multiple elements of hardware breaking. And then the last thing is, quite often people underestimate the effort that will be involved in recovering from a computer crash. So that's something where you can put some thought in, and that's something I'm trying to do with my backup regime, in that if something really bad happens, I want to be able to be up and running very quickly. So for example, I have a second computer which is almost identical to my main computer, just as a alternate standby machine. I make image copies, which means the hard disks in my main computer are copied exactly byte for byte on external hard disks that I then can connect to my standby computer, boot it up, and continue working as if never anything happened. So in my line of work, I can't essentially I can't cope with being disconnected from my computer for longer than a few hours. So it's important to estimate the effort involved. If you just use a standard time machine on a Mac and your computer crashes, then it will take a fairly long time before you have your computer up and running again. So you go to the store and buy a new computer, then start restoring. You'll be busy a few hours at least. On a Windows machine, you might be busy for days before you actually can get back to working order. So what is my specific backup setup? So I have a fair number of them. First of all, my main workstation, this computer I'm doing this presentation on, uses Time Machine. So it's an Apple Mac. I have Time Machine, and it has 3 Time Machine drives. So if I go into my system preferences and I look at Time Machine, you can see here I have 3 drives. I have Winnie Time Machine 2, Winnie Time Machine, and D1 8TB. So that's an 8 terabyte drive, which is half full. I have a 2 terabyte drive, which has 220 gigs on it, and this one I don't know exactly. It's also a fairly large drive. See, and I can see here, I can actually go back to May 26th of 2018. So I have backups spanning all that way. I can go back to 28th of September on this Time Machine, and I can go back whatever. So the main thing is, these drives are just safeguarding against breakage, because one of them eventually will break. So I don't want to rely on a single hard drive to keep my Time Machine. So that's why I spread it over 3 of them. And you can clearly see the backups with Time Machine have a limited time. So eventually this drive, when it starts filling up, Time Machine will automatically start deleting older backups. So this might actually move forward. This might suddenly become 1st of November 2019 as the older backups disappear. But Time Machine is nice in that it tries to keep as much. So local snapshots as space permits, hourly backups for the past 24 hours. So it means for hour by hour, for the past 24 hours, I can go back in time and get files back that were on my computer. Daily backups for the month, and then weekly backups for as long as possible. So that's a fairly nice way to do it. So that's Time Machine, and we can actually see Time Machine in action. So if I just take any folder, let's take my desktop. That's a nice and busy folder, and then I can just go to my enter Time Machine, and it will now show me a timeline of what has been on the desktop. See, I can go step by step back. See, today at 5 I had a movie there, and today at 1:49 I only had a file called tPoint log there, and then today at 9:58 there was nothing there. See, and I can go here. Here's a long timeline. So I can go, say, like on the 23rd of October 2019, what was there? Well, there was these files, and I can just select one of them and then say restore, and those files will come back. So this is really nice, but the main thing to remember is that if you're using a Mac and you have Time Machine, the larger these drives, the better. So I've met a woman once who had Time Machine, and she assumed that Time Machine was going to kind of be an archive. And what in reality, the Time Machine was exactly the same size as her internal hard drive. So the backup that was on that Time Machine was essentially just an image copy of her internal hard drive. There was no room to store any history, any past history. So there was nothing else. So then came the day she needed to restore a file from a few months ago. And of course it was not there because that Time Machine drive was way too small. So what you do is, if you have Time Machine, or if you use Time Machine, get the biggest drive you can afford or can get and use that as a Time Machine. And it has to be bigger than your internal hard drive. So, and the bigger it, the better. So the more history it will retain for you. So that's Time Machine. So that's something that my computer does all the time. I have 3 drives and I keep on backing up to those Time Machine drives. Another one I use, and that runs every night, is Super Duper, and that's an image backup software. So you can see here in the log what it has done. So like the last copy here on June 29th to a drive called Winnie VMS Backup and Winnie Backup. See, this thing will just make image copies of my internal drives over and over, and I have 3 sets of drives. They're all connected to the computer at the same time, but they're not online, they're not mounted. But the software will automatically mount them as needed and start copying and make these drives identical, byte for byte identical to my internal hard drive, which means I can disconnect them from this computer, connect them to another Mac, boot that Mac of these drives. So if I boot my second Mac, my standby Mac of Winnie Backup, it will look exactly like my main computer which is called Winnie. So that's another thing. And the reason why I do it this way and not just Time Machine is that, first of all, it's an extra type of backup. So it's a second version of the backup, and again in threefold. But it's also the time to restore is very quick. So all I need to do is boot up a standby computer and I'm back in business. Whereas if I only had Time Machine, I would have to boot up my standby computer, do a restore, which would take multiple hours, and then I would be back in business. Then the third option is Backblaze, and that's this thing here. See, and right now I'm up to date. Backblaze is up to date, so updated as of today. See, and in total there is 1 terabyte of data backed up at Backblaze. And if you look at settings, so Backblaze is really nice in that it will back up any external drive you connect to the computer, as long as you connect it all the time. So for example, my internal drive is Winnie, but I also have a drive called 1024, which is just a lot of stuff, customer data and so on. I have audio visual, which is my Lightroom archive. And these are time machines it knows not to back up, but my audio visual is all my picture collection. That's all there. This one is one I don't use often. And the nice thing is there's no extra cost. So as long as you connect these drives at least every week or within a fortnight and allow it to make the backup, they will be backed up. So size is not a price point. It doesn't. The cost for Backblaze does not depend on the amount of drives you have. The only thing is they have to be online. They have to be connected to the computer. So this one is actually taking care of my Lightroom backup. So there's more of those, but that's one of them. And my internal drives of my computer are also backed up. So Backblaze is the one where you can actually ask them to send you a copy on a hard disk. So they will send you another hard disk with a copy of all the drives. And they have a web interface where you can then consult the drives that have been backed up and look where they are, and you can access individual files. So I can just click here to go there. There we are. Made it wrong. Okay. I need a special code. It's all very secure. Backblaze, where is it? Here. 197941. Right. See, and I can now see I have a computer called Richard, a computer called Walter, and Winnie, which is my main workstation. You see version history 1 year, so I'm actually paying for an extra. Normally it's only 30 days. See, and here are the drives that are being backed up, and then I can look at things and I can say restore, which I won't do, but I can actually view and restore files. So individual files can be restored and so on and so on. So this is just an online backup. So not an archival service, it's a backup service. So very nice, I like that. Then for proper archiving, I bought a pile of 1 terabyte drives, which are, there's a company called PB Tech, and they occasionally sell heaps of cheap hard drives. And they're just second-hand drives that are taken from laptops, ex-lease laptops and whatever. So these drives are typically not extremely used. And you can just buy them for, like I bought 20 of them for $50 a piece. And then I just make multiple copies to archival drives and then store those away. So they have a longer lifetime than SSD drives, and they're fairly cheap. At the same time, I also archive to Blu-ray discs, so and DVDs, and write them to DVDs. So I typically make 2 copies to 2 different laptop drives, and then I also make copies to DVD drives. And I do those twice as well. So in total I have 4 copies for archival. For publishing, I just use Flickr and Instagram. And then for cloud, I have Nextcloud. And Nextcloud is just like Dropbox, so we can have a quick look there. See, I can just access a folder on my hard disk, so I'll log in. Or I can also log in via the browser. And this works anywhere in the world, so I can actually log into this. This is just a little device that sits under my staircase. And you can, for example, have a look at images. So this is actually some images I have there. So if I just double click those, come on, single click maybe. Yeah, there it is. See, You can actually view the files there. You can download them. It's like cloud storage. It's exactly like Dropbox. I share the files between computers, but I control the server. So that's a pretty good deal. And that's it. Alrighty, over to the questions now.